Chapter 1. The Echo of Silence. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of a coffee cup she hadn't touched in an hour. The house was quiet. Too quiet. It was a kind of quiet that made the walls feel smaller, the air heavier. Her husband Thomas had just left for work, his departure marked by a brief kiss on her forehead and a distracted, "See you later." He never used to be like this. The connection they had once shared, full of laughter, affection, and warmth, had frayed over the years. But today, it felt more distant than ever. The morning routine had been automatic, like it always was. Clara prepared breakfast while Thomas read the paper. They exchanged pleasantries, but the silence between them was growing, each moment stretching the gap just a little wider. Clara couldn't help but notice the absence of tenderness in his words. His mind seemed somewhere else, on work, on the children, on anything but her. It wasn't that she didn't love him. She did. She loved him deeply, but over the years, the passion had faded. She wasn't the carefree woman he had married anymore, and he wasn't the attentive husband he once had been. Their lives had become a series of routines, conversations that seemed more like transactions than anything meaningful. Thomas worked long hours in finance, often late into the evening. He had become absorbed in his career, so consumed by the demands of his job that he no longer had the energy for anything else. Clara had tried to fill the emptiness by throwing herself into their children and the house, but there was something missing. Something more than just attention. Something deep inside her that ached for connection, for excitement. Chapter 2. The arrival of Alexis started innocently enough. Clara had decided to join a book club that met once a week at a local cafe. She had always loved to read, but over the years, books had become background noise. She needed to feel a part of something again, to have a conversation that didn't revolve around schedules, bills, or the kids' homework. One Wednesday evening, Clara sat at the cafe, flipping through the pages of a book she'd barely started, when a man slid into the chair across from her. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, his smile easy and confident. "The seat next to you was taken." Clara looked up, meeting his eyes. He was attractive in an understated way, with dark hair, sharp features, and a presence that seemed to fill the room without him trying. He exuded an effortless confidence that made Clara's heart race, something she hadn't felt in years. "I was just reading," Clara replied with a smile, marking her page and setting the book aside. "No problem at all." Over the next few weeks, their conversations became longer and more personal. His name was Alex. He was a writer, a self-proclaimed wanderer who had recently moved to the city to pursue a more grounded life. Clara found herself drawn to him, not just physically, but emotionally. Alex had a way of making her feel heard, making her feel seen. He asked her about her dreams, her past, and the things that made her laugh. And for the first time in months, Clara found herself laughing again, genuinely laughing. Alex wasn't the kind of man she usually found herself attracted to. He didn't have the steady reliability of Thomas. He wasn't interested in the predictable rhythm of suburban life. He was wild, untethered, and his words often carried a romanticism that made Clara's heart flutter. She tried to brush it off, telling herself she was just enjoying the novelty of conversation, but deep down, she knew it was more. One night, as they sat together, their knees brushing, Alex looked at her in a way that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her, his gaze searching, almost intense. "You know," Alex said quietly, "you're the most fascinating person I've met in a long time. You don't realize how beautiful you are when you smile." Clara blinked, her heart pounding. She hadn't heard words like that in so long. Certainly not from Thomas, who had become so focused on everything else. For a moment, she found herself lost in Alex's gaze, her thoughts disoriented by the way he made her feel. Chapter 3. Crossing a Line. The first time they kissed was entirely unplanned. It was after one of their regular coffee meetups, and they had taken a walk through the nearby park. The autumn air was crisp, the golden leaves swirling around them. They stood at the edge of a pond, watching the ducks swim in lazy circles, when Alex turned to her. "I don't know what it is about you," he said, his voice low and serious, "but I can't stop thinking about you." Clara looked up at him, her heart racing. She should have pulled away, should have stopped it right there. She had a family, she was married. But in that moment, standing in the cool autumn air with Alex's intense gaze on her, she didn't want to stop. "I've been feeling the same way," Clara whispered, almost too afraid to say it out loud. The words felt foreign, dangerous, but they were true. Before she could say anything more, Alex cupped her face gently in his hands, his lips brushing against hers. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant even, but then it deepened. Clara's mind raced, but her body responded instinctively. She had forgotten what it felt like to be kissed like this, passionately, without hesitation. She was lost in the moment, in the warmth of Alex's touch. When they finally broke apart, Clara's breath was shallow, her heart pounding. She looked at him, wide-eyed, as if waking from a dream. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, taking a step back. "I shouldn't have done that." Alex reached for her hand, stopping her from leaving. "Don't apologize. You don't have to explain yourself. I just wanted you to know how I feel." Clara stood there frozen, caught in the web of desire and guilt. She knew she had crossed a line, but part of her didn't want to step back. The thrill of the kiss, the excitement of being desired. It was intoxicating. Chapter 4. The torn heart. Over the next few weeks, Clara and Alex continued to meet in secret. Their encounters became more frequent, more intense. Clara would sneak away while Thomas was at work, telling him she was running errands or meeting a friend. But with every stolen kiss, every lingering touch, the weight of her deception grew heavier. She had stopped telling Thomas about the book club meetings. She made excuses for why she was late, why she didn't want to talk. The guilt gnawed at her, but the thrill of being with Alex, of feeling desired, of feeling alive, was a drug she couldn't quit. One evening, as she sat in her car, parked outside a quiet cafe where she was supposed to meet Alex, Clara's phone buzzed. It was Thomas. "How's everything? Kids are good. Just wanted to check in. Love you." Clara stared at the text, her heart sinking. She had never meant for things to go this far. She never imagined she would betray Thomas. But she had. She couldn't deny it anymore. The thought of ending things with Alex crossed her mind, but then she thought of the last time she and Thomas had made love, how he was tired, distracted, barely present. And then she thought of Alex's touch, the fire in his eyes, and the way he made her feel like the woman she had once been. Clara had a choice to make. She could go home, face Thomas, and try to fix things, or she could meet Alex and keep chasing the rush, the excitement that had pulled her in so easily. The buzzer on her phone sounded again. This time it was a picture, a message from Alex. "I miss you already." Her heart hammered in her chest. She replied quickly, her fingers trembling. "I miss you too. I'll be there in 5. Chapter 5. The Consequences. The next few days passed in a blur. Clara went through the motions of family life, feeling disconnected from her own actions. She felt the weight of her betrayal pressing down on her, suffocating her, but every time she looked at Alex, every time they met, the tension lifted, if only for a little while. But then one evening, as Clara was preparing dinner, her phone rang. It was Thomas. He sounded different. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice tight. "About something. Can you come to the living room?" Clara's stomach dropped. She knew. She felt it in her gut. Thomas had found out. She walked slowly into the living room, where Thomas sat, his hands clenched together, his eyes dark with concern. "I know," he said quietly. "About you and Alex." Clara froze, her heart pounding. For a moment, time seemed to stop. "I don't know how long this has been going on," Thomas continued, "but I found the texts, Clara. I found the pictures, the lies." Clara's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the couch, her mind reeling. She had been caught. Everything she had done, everything she had tried to hide, was exposed. There was no going back now. Thomas didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he just stared at her, his eyes full of hurt. "Why, Clara?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Why would you do this?" Clara's throat was tight and the words wouldn't come. She wanted to apologize, to explain, but she couldn't. How could she explain something so messy, so complicated, so shameful? I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Epilogue. The aftermath in. The weeks that followed, Clara and Thomas tried to rebuild their relationship, but the foundation was shattered. Thomas had moved out temporarily, needing space to think. Clara, devastated by her actions, spent her days in a blur of guilt and regret. Alex, meanwhile, disappeared from her life, leaving her to face the consequences of her choices alone. Clara's affair had been a moment of escape, a desperate attempt to recapture the parts of herself she had lost. But in the end, it had cost her everything: her marriage, her trust, and her sense of who she was. As the months passed, Clara realized that healing was possible, but it required more than just time. It required honesty, self-reflection, and the willingness to face the parts of herself that had led her to this point. Whether or not her marriage would survive was still uncertain, but Clara had learned that no moment of passion, no matter how intense, was worth sacrificing everything she held dear. Chapter 5. The Consequences. The next few days passed in a blur. Clara went through the motions of family life, feeling disconnected from her own actions. She felt the weight of her betrayal. Title: The Distance Between Us. Continued. Chapter 6. The Weight of Silence. The house was too quiet. Clara stood in the kitchen, staring at the dishes she had left in the sink for hours. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter as the weight of the situation settled in. She hadn't seen Thomas in days. He'd moved out, staying at a friend's place, giving them both the space he had asked for. The emotional distance between them now felt permanent. It wasn't just the physical separation. It was as if their marriage had fractured into something unrecognizable. Clara felt ashamed. Ashamed of the affair, ashamed of how easily she had betrayed Thomas. The guilt gnawed at her insides, making it hard to breathe. She had told herself it was just a phase, that it was a way to escape her own unhappiness, but she now understood how much damage it had caused. She had taken something fragile and broken it. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly 6 p.m. She had been avoiding him, her phone silenced, her heart refusing to face the inevitable conversation that was coming. Thomas would come home soon. He'd been at his office working late as usual. She could feel it. The storm that had been building for weeks was finally going to break. Chapter 7. A Conversation. Long overdue. Clara was in the living room when Thomas walked through the door. His face was gaunt, tired. But there was something else there too. Something sharper. He didn't greet her. He didn't offer a, "How are you?" or "It's good to see you." He simply walked past her, headed straight for the couch. Clara stood, frozen, unsure of how to approach him. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to apologize, to explain, to beg him to understand. But she was scared. Scared of the hurt. Scared of what he would say. Scared that maybe she didn't deserve his forgiveness. Thomas sat down, running a hand through his disheveled hair. His eyes were hollow, like he hadn't slept in days. It was as if the man she had known, the man she married, was slipping away. replaced by something darker, more distant. "I don't know what to say to you anymore," Thomas said finally, his voice strained. "You've broken my trust in ways I didn't think possible. And for what? For someone else? For excitement?" Clara felt a pang of hurt at the word excitement. Was that all it had been to him? Just a fleeting moment of passion? To Clara, it had been more than that. She had been desperate, desperate for something she hadn't even understood. But now, sitting here with Thomas, the weight of it all crushed her. "I never meant to hurt you, Thomas," Clara said, her voice shaking. She swallowed, tears welling in her eyes. I was so lost. I felt so invisible to you for so long, and when I met Alex, he made me feel like I mattered again." Thomas didn't say anything. He simply stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and pain. "You don't think I feel the same way?" he asked after a long silence. His voice was cold now, like a glacier forming between them. "I don't know when it happened, Clara. I don't know when we became this." He gestured between them. "I don't know how I failed you, but I've been trying every single day to hold this thing together." Clara took a step closer, but then stopped, the distance between them suddenly feeling insurmountable. "I didn't see it. I didn't see how much you were trying. I was so caught up in how I felt, like I was invisible. I felt so alone, Thomas, and then Alex came along, and he made me feel like someone saw me again." "Someone," Thomas repeated, bitterness lacing his voice. "Someone you didn't even know. Someone you thought could fill the gap I couldn't. But Clara, you were so focused on finding that somewhere else, you didn't even realize that I was here, right here, trying to make things better, trying to be your partner." Clara's chest tightened. She had no excuse. He was right. All she had been focused on was her own dissatisfaction, her own emptiness, without seeing the toll it had taken on him, on their relationship. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, the words feeling hollow and empty, but they were the only words she could offer in that moment. "I am so sorry. I don't know how I can make this right." Thomas looked at her, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. But he didn't say anything. He simply stood up and walked toward the door, pausing for a moment before turning to face her again. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Clara. Not yet. Maybe not ever." His voice was steady, but Clara could hear the hurt laced in every syllable. He stepped outside, the door closing quietly behind him. Clara collapsed onto the couch, her breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. She had lost him. She had broken him. She had lost everything. Chapter 8. The Long Road. Ahead. The following weeks felt like a blur. Thomas stayed at a friend's house for a while, and they exchanged messages here and there, but nothing was the same. Clara spent her days replaying every moment of the affair, every word she had said, every choice she had made. But no amount of self-flagellation could change what had already happened. What was done was done. She tried to talk to Alex once after Thomas found out. He hadn't responded to her calls, her texts, and when she visited his apartment, he wasn't there. It was as if he had disappeared completely from her life, leaving her with nothing but her regrets. In the silence, Clara had nothing but time to think about everything, the reasons behind her actions, the emotional void she had been trying to fill, and the love she had taken for granted. She had tried to find herself in someone else's arms, and now she was left alone, with only the broken pieces of her marriage scattered around her. Clara knew that she had a long road ahead of her. If Thomas ever came back, it wouldn't be easy. The trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship was gone, and it would take time to rebuild it, if it could ever be rebuilt at all. Chapter 9. Rebuilding. Months passed. It wasn't easy. Thomas didn't come home right away, and when he did, things were never the same. They spoke sparingly at first, often in tense, strained tones, avoiding eye contact, avoiding the truth that was too painful to face head-on. But slowly, things began to change. Clara started therapy, both individual therapy and couples therapy. She had to look at the dark corners of her soul, confront the pain she had been running from for so long. The affair was a symptom of a deeper issue, and only by facing that could she begin to heal. Thomas, too, went to therapy. He didn't forgive her immediately, but he didn't walk away either. The cracks in their marriage were obvious to both of them now, but over time, they began to talk about the things they had ignored for so long, the emotional distance, the lack of communication, the resentment that had quietly built up between them. It wasn't perfect. There were still days when Clara wondered if Thomas would ever truly forgive her. There were nights when she lay awake wondering if he had truly moved on from what had happened, but there was also hope, a glimmer of it. Maybe they could rebuild, piece by piece, with time, patience, and a lot of hard work. But Clara knew one thing for sure. She would never forget what she had learned. The affair had shattered her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but it also taught her about herself, about what she had been searching for, and about the kind of person she wanted to be. As for Alex, she would never see him again. The affair, though brief, had served its purpose. It had shown her the cracks in her own soul. It had made her realize that happiness couldn't be found in someone else, not in a fleeting moment of passion or an illusion of connection. It had to be found within herself, and perhaps with Thomas, if they could find their way back to each other. Epilogue. The road. Forward, Clara sat at the kitchen table once again, this time with Thomas beside her. The silence wasn't so oppressive anymore. There was still so much to work through, but for the first time in a long while, they were facing each other. Not as enemies, not as strangers, but as partners. They still had a long way to go. The road ahead was uncertain, but Clara finally understood that redemption wasn't a single moment of forgiveness. It was a journey, and she was willing to take it, no matter how difficult it would be. Her marriage was broken, but it wasn't beyond repair. Not yet. And for the first time in months, Clara believed that maybe, just maybe, they could make it work. Chapter 10. The Reckoning. Clara woke up to the sound of her phone vibrating on the nightstand. She squinted, the morning sunlight still muted through the curtains, and picked up the device. It was 7:15 a.m., too early for a call from Thomas, but it wasn't his name on the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat. She had been avoiding any form of communication with Alex since that night she and Thomas had confronted their issues. She had made a vow to herself, no more hiding, no more lies, but the pull to check the message was undeniable. She clicked on it, and the text sent a wave of unease through her body. "We need to talk. It's about us. I can't do this anymore. Alex." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Us. The word stung. It wasn't a simple "I miss you," or a vague message like the ones they had exchanged before. This was serious. She could feel the gravity of the words in her bones. Her hand trembled as she placed the phone back down on the nightstand. She closed her eyes, trying to center herself, but the memories of what had transpired between her and Alex flooded her mind. His smile, his touch, his wild, unapologetic energy. It felt like an entire life ago, yet so recent. She thought she had left it all behind. That was supposed to be a chapter closed, but Alex, it seemed, wasn't done. And neither was she. Chapter 11. The pull of the past Clara's day dragged on. She couldn't concentrate on anything. Work, errands, or even talking to the kids. Her mind kept drifting back to the message, to the unresolved feelings she had shoved down so deep inside of her. Despite all the therapy, despite the brokenness she and Thomas had slowly begun to heal, Clara couldn't escape the pull she felt toward Alex. She had told herself that her affair with him was a mistake, a fleeting distraction, nothing more than an escape from a marriage that had lost its spark. But deep down, she knew it had been more than that. It had been an affirmation, a reminder that she could still be desired, still be wanted, that there was more to her than the tired, worn-down version she had become. Alex had made her feel alive in a way that Thomas hadn't in years. But did that mean she should pursue it? Was that fair to Thomas? To her family? At 3:00 p.m., Clara stood at her kitchen counter, looking at the phone again. It was still there, the message from Alex, waiting, hanging in the air between her and her sense of responsibility. The guilt from her affair was still fresh, still overwhelming. Yet the desire to understand what Alex had meant by his message clawed at her. What did he want? Why now? She stared at the message for a long time, her finger hovering over the screen. Finally, she typed back. "What is it, Alex? What do you want from me?" The response came quickly. "I need to see you, to understand what we were, if anything at all." Clara hesitated. She knew she should walk away, let it go. She had her life now, with her family, with the man she had once loved deeply. But Alex had a way of unraveling her thoughts, making her question everything she thought she knew. She wanted to say no so badly, to tell him that their chapter was over, but something inside her, something raw and hungry, kept her tethered to the idea of him. Before she could stop herself, her fingers typed a response. "Okay, I'll meet you." Chapter 12. A moment of clarity. Later that night, Clara found herself sitting in her car outside a dimly lit bar, her hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were her only lifeline. The city lights flickered around her, casting shadows on the streets. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she realized she was terrified. Not of Alex, but of herself. What had she done? What was she doing now? The rational part of her mind screamed at her to turn around, to go back home and face the consequences of her actions. But the other part, the part she'd been denying for so long, urged her to go inside and see Alex, to confront whatever had drawn her to him in the first place. When she walked into the bar, Alex was already sitting at a corner table. He was wearing a casual jacket, his hair messy but somehow still perfect. He looked up as she entered, and his eyes softened when they landed on her. There was no smile, no warmth, just a steady, intense gaze that seemed to read her soul. "Clara," he said softly, standing as she approached. "You came." "I shouldn't have," she admitted, her voice quiet. She slid into the seat across from him, avoiding his gaze. Alex leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Then why are you here?" Clara's heart raced. She didn't know how to explain it, didn't know how to admit the pull he still had over her, the way he made her feel. The truth felt so much darker now, more complicated. Her marriage was fragile. Her family was hanging by a thread. What had she expected to find here? I don't know," she said, finally meeting his eyes. "I thought I could let it go, but it's harder than I thought. You made me feel something I hadn't felt in years, Alex. Something I thought I'd lost, but now." She looked down at the table, her voice cracking. "Now it feels like I'm betraying everything. My family, Thomas, my children." Alex's face hardened, though his voice remained calm. "But what about you, Clara? What about what you need?" Clara flinched at the question, the weight of it heavy in the air between them. "I've been so focused on trying to fix everything, trying to fix them," she gestured vaguely. "But I lost myself along the way. I don't know who I am anymore. I thought I'd find some clarity by being with you, but all I feel is more confused." Alex's eyes softened then, the intensity in them turning into something more sympathetic. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I never meant to make you feel this way, Clara. I just wanted you to remember that you're more than just a wife or a mother. You deserve to feel alive, too." Clara felt tears well up, but she held them back. She hadn't wanted to cry in front of him, hadn't wanted to admit how broken she was, but it was too much. The weight of the lies, the guilt, the overwhelming need to reclaim something she felt she had lost. It was all too much. "I don't know if I can fix this, Alex," she whispered. "I don't know if I can go back to who I was, or if I want to. I don't know what I want anymore." Alex didn't say anything at first. He just watched her, his gaze softening with understanding. The silence stretched on between them, both of them lost in their thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "I don't expect you to have the answers right now, but I think you need to figure out what's important to you, what you need." Chapter 13. The Breaking Point. Clara returned home that night with a head full of conflicting emotions. Her mind felt like a battlefield, torn between the life she had with Thomas, the family she had built, and the intense, passionate escape she had found with Alex. Both felt like parts of her, but neither seemed to fit her entirely anymore. When she walked through the door, she was met with the familiar yet unfamiliar silence of their home. Thomas was sitting on the couch, his eyes tired but expectant. He had been waiting for her, probably for hours, but he hadn't called or texted. He hadn't asked where she was or who she was with. It was as though he already knew. "I was thinking about what you said," Thomas began, his voice steady but weary. "About rebuilding, about finding us again. But Clara—" He paused, his eyes searching hers for something. "Do you still want this? Do you still want us?" Clara stood there, the weight of the question hanging in the air. She had never realized how much she had taken for granted. The stability, the comfort, the love that had once been there. But she had let it slip away. She had ignored it, looking for something more, something exciting, something that would make her feel alive again. But the truth was, Thomas had been there all along. He had always been there, waiting. The difference was that she had been the one to drift away, and now she was the one who had to make a choice. "I don't know," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know anymore." Chapter 14. Choosing a Path. The days that followed were full of difficult conversations and raw moments. Clara had to face the truth about herself, about her marriage, her affair, and the part of her that was still lost. She needed to understand that running from her problems wasn't the answer. Neither was trying to fix them with someone else. She had to rebuild, not just her marriage, but herself. Chapter 15. A Torn Heart. The days following that night were grueling. Thomas and Clara hadn't spoken much, and the silence that hung between them was more suffocating than either of them had expected. He had gone back to his routine, immersing himself in work as a way to avoid the emotional devastation, while Clara tried to make sense of the wreckage she had created. She couldn't sleep at night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of her family, Thomas, her children, smiling, happy, before everything came crashing down. Then there was Alex, a blur of excitement and lust, but also something deeper. Something that had felt real in the moment, something that made her feel important again. But now, that fleeting connection felt more like a hollow memory, an escape from reality that had cost her so much. Clara had tried to reach out to Thomas, but every time she did, he pulled back, emotionally distant. He was hurt and he couldn't hide it. The walls between them were growing higher every day, and Clara knew she had to break through them. If only she knew how. She thought about Alex, though. It had been days since their meeting at the bar, and she hadn't heard from him. Part of her was relieved. She had promised herself she wouldn't go back to that world. But another part of her still felt a deep ache. She knew she wasn't ready to face Thomas fully, not yet, not when the cracks in their marriage seemed so wide. One night, after the kids were asleep, Clara sat alone in the living room, her mind racing. She had to make a decision. Was she willing to lose everything to preserve the one thing she had built? Her marriage? Or was she destined to continue searching for something that could never be found? As if on cue, her phone buzzed. It was Alex. Chapter 16. A decision. Clara stared at the message for what seemed like an eternity. Can we talk? Please, I need to know what this was, what we are, what you and I mean. I can't let this go. She felt her pulse quicken. There it was again, the temptation, the promise of something different, something exciting, something forbidden. But wasn't this the same pattern that had led her to ruin in the first place? Her fingers hovered over the screen and she almost typed back, "I'm not sure. I don't think I can do this again." But then another thought crossed her mind. What if she didn't have to choose between Thomas and Alex? What if she could just be with herself for once, figure out who she was outside of her roles as a wife and mother? Could she do that? Or had she already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed? Clara closed her eyes, then slowly typed, "I'm sorry, Alex. I've made a mess of everything. I don't know what this was, but I can't keep doing this. I have a family. I need to fix what I've broken." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The response came almost instantly. "I understand. I really do. I hope you find what you're looking for. You deserve to be happy, Clara. Just don't forget who you are." Clara stared at the message for a few seconds before locking her phone and tossing it on the couch. She felt lighter, but also profoundly sad. Alex had been a momentary escape, a brief fire in her otherwise mundane life. But now, she was back to square one, standing at the precipice of her choices. She had broken her own heart, and now she had to fix it. Chapter 15. A Torn Heart. The days following that night were grueling. Thomas and Clara hadn't spoken much, and the silence that hung between them was more suffocating than either of them had expected. He had gone back to his routine, immersing himself in work as a way to avoid the emotional devastation, while Clara tried to make sense of the wreckage she had created. She couldn't sleep at night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of her family, Thomas, her children, smiling, happy, before everything came crashing down. Then there was Alex, a blur of excitement and lust, but also something deeper, something that had felt real in the moment, something that made her feel important again. But now, that fleeting connection felt more like a hollow memory, an escape from reality that had cost her so much. Clara had tried to reach out to Thomas, but every time she did, he pulled back, emotionally distant. He was hurt and he couldn't hide it. The walls between them were growing higher every day, and Clara knew she had to break through them. If only she knew how. She thought about Alex, though. It had been days since their meeting at the bar, and she hadn't heard from him. Part of her was relieved. She had promised herself she wouldn't go back to that world. But another part of her still felt a deep ache. She knew she wasn't ready to face Thomas fully, not yet, not when the cracks in their marriage seemed so wide. One night, after the kids were asleep, Clara sat alone in the living room, her mind racing. She had to make a decision. Was she willing to lose everything to preserve the one thing she had built? Her marriage? Or was she destined to continue searching for something that could never be found? As if on cue, her phone buzzed. It was Alex. Chapter 16. A decision. Clara stared at the message for what seemed like an eternity. Can we talk? Please, I need to know what this was, what we are, what you and I mean. I can't let this go. She felt her pulse quicken. There it was again, the temptation, the promise of something different, something exciting, something forbidden. But wasn't this the same pattern that had led her to ruin in the first place? Her fingers hovered over the screen and she almost typed back, "I'm not sure. I don't think I can do this again." But then another thought crossed her mind. What if she didn't have to choose between Thomas and Alex? What if she could just be with herself for once, figure out who she was outside of her roles as a wife and mother. Could she do that? Or had she already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed? Clara closed her eyes, then slowly typed, "I'm sorry, Alex. I've made a mess of everything. I don't know what this was, but I can't keep doing this. I have a family. I need to fix what I've broken." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The response came almost instantly. "I understand. I really do. I hope you find what you're looking for. You deserve to be happy, Clara. Just don't forget who you are." Clara stared at the message for a few seconds before locking her phone and tossing it on the couch. She felt lighter, but also profoundly sad. Alex had been a momentary escape, a brief fire in her otherwise mundane life. But now, she was back to square one, standing at the precipice of her choices. She had broken her own heart, and now she had to fix it. Chapter 19. A new divide. It had been 3 months since Clara and Thomas had started their slow, painful journey toward healing. Their days were filled with small steps, like fixing broken things they had long ignored. Simple things, like making dinner together again, or talking about their day. They had become strangers to each other for so long, but now they were inching their way back toward something more familiar. It wasn't the same. It could never be the same. But it was a start. However, the wounds from Clara's affair were far from healed. Thomas was still distant at times, like there was a wall between them that he couldn't quite break through. He was trying, but Clara could see it in his eyes, the suspicion, the hurt that wouldn't fully fade. She could feel it too, like a shadow that hovered just over her shoulder. Every time Thomas left the room, she had to fight the overwhelming desire to check her phone, to see if Alex had reached out. The pull to him had faded, but only in small, incremental shifts. Alex had never contacted her again, which made Clara feel like the time they had shared was nothing more than a brief, confusing chapter in her life. But it hadn't been. It had meant something, hadn't it? One evening, when Thomas was at a work dinner, Clara sat on the couch, flipping through old photo albums with a glass of wine in her hand. She found herself staring at pictures of the two of them. Their wedding, vacations, birthdays. They had been so happy once. She had loved him fiercely, and somewhere along the way she had lost sight of that love. A text message popped up on her phone. "Clara, I can't stop thinking about you." It was from Alex. Chapter 21. The Unraveling. The message from Alex lingered in Clara's mind like an echo she couldn't shake. "I can't stop thinking about you." Those words were simple, but they dug into her chest like an old wound she had hoped would heal, but never truly did. The moment she read them, everything from the affair, the stolen kisses, the late-night whispers, the rushed encounters, came rushing back in a flood. The sensation of being desired, of feeling seen in a way Thomas had not made her feel in a long time, seemed to smolder in the pit of her stomach. Clara wasn't naive. She knew that responding to Alex's message was a dangerous game. A part of her had already made the decision months ago that her relationship with him needed to be closed forever. But in that moment, the weight of the choice felt unbearable. She had built something with Thomas, something fragile, something barely held together. And yet, there was part of her that still felt lost, incomplete. She hesitated before responding. "I can't do this. I'm trying to fix my marriage." She hit send and immediately regretted it. The phone buzzed with an incoming call. Her stomach dropped. It was Alex. Her hand trembled as she stared at the screen, torn between the guilt of picking up the phone and the pull of a voice she hadn't heard in months. She wanted to hang up, to move on, but somehow a part of her needed closure. After a long pause, she answered. "Clara." Alex's voice crackled through the speaker, warm, but tinged with something darker. "I don't want to make this difficult, but I need to know. What are we doing here? You said you were trying to fix things with him, but I can't shake the feeling that you're just pretending." You were never happy with him, Clara. You told me that yourself. Her heart raced, her palms sweating as she clutched the phone to her ear. Alex's words felt like a knife, twisting deeper into the wound she'd been nursing. She remembered those nights with him, when Thomas was distant, when Clara felt invisible. Alex had made her feel beautiful, wanted, and needed. How could she forget that? How could she ignore it? "I'm not pretending," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "I love him, Alex. I love Thomas." "Then why did you come to me?" Alex pressed. His voice was softer now, almost a whisper. "Why did you choose me when you had him?" Clara closed her eyes, as though she could shut the whole world out by shutting her eyes. She didn't have an answer. She didn't have an excuse. She had let herself fall into something she never intended to, a moment of weakness that turned into a secret she couldn't escape. "I was lost," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I thought I needed something more. I thought I needed to feel wanted in a way that I hadn't felt in years. But I've made a mistake. I know I've made a mistake. And I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Clara could hear Alex breathing, his words hanging in the air unspoken. She could almost see him, sitting there, perhaps running his hand through his hair, wondering if this was the end. She had no idea. "Okay," Alex finally said. "If that's really what you want, Clara, if you're sure, but don't pretend that this didn't mean something to you. I won't let you forget that." His voice was distant now, colder than it had been before. "I won't forget," she replied, her throat tightening. "But I can't keep hurting the people I love. I can't keep doing this to myself either." With that, the call ended. Chapter 22. Tipping the Scales. The next few days passed in a haze. Clara was deeply shaken by her conversation with Alex, the finality of it haunting her. She knew she had made the right choice, but the sense of guilt still clung to her like a second skin. She had made a promise to herself to fix things with Thomas, but now there was a new barrier in their relationship, one of emotional distance and unspoken things. She had told Thomas everything, the affair, the lies, the betrayal, and yet something still felt off between them. It wasn't the same. They were both trying to heal, but healing required trust, and trust was something that would take a long time to rebuild. Clara spent more time with her children, trying to redirect her focus. The guilt over what she had done to Thomas, what she had done to their family, was like a constant pressure in her chest, and every time she looked at them, it reminded her of the consequences of her actions. But even as she tried to reconnect with Thomas and her children, her thoughts often drifted back to Alex. His words haunted her. "Don't pretend this didn't mean something." And then came the moment she had been dreading. It was a Sunday afternoon. Thomas was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, and Clara was sitting across from him, trying to figure out what to make for dinner. The house was quiet, the children outside playing, everything sea.